Welcome. My name is Michelle Bajarnik. I'm a registered psychologist and leadership and wellbeing coach, and I do a lot of training with both individuals and organisations. And today I'm coming through to you from a different medium. Normally I'd be standing in front of a range of different people. Today it's just you and me. So I think we've got to recognise at the moment that we are going through a lot of significant challenges, and a lot of people are feeling a lot of different emotions. And we've got to think about how we're not only going to survive this period of time, but even potentially thrive through some very difficult circumstances. So I'm going to take you through a series of potential concepts and opportunities to think about new ways you could embrace this challenge that's facing us. A lot of people are experiencing a lot of different emotions given COVID-19. We've got fear, we've got anxiety, there's blame, we've got panic buying. We are worried about potential illness, not only to ourselves, but the people that we love, the people that we work with. There's this constant worry about the what ifs and if only I'd have bought more toilet paper when everybody else was panic buying. Maybe I'd have some now. We've got to think about that here and now for us, because that worry takes us into the future where potentially it's not always useful for us. And if we're worrying about future, we're constantly thinking about what next could happen. If you haven't seen this acronym before, VUCA, VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think that's exactly what we are currently dealing with. We are living in a very much a VUCA landscape and thinking about constantly being uncertain as to what's going to come next, the complexity of working from home for the first time, the ambiguity of knowing what the expectations are of us working from home or trying to interact with people who are working from home. This is our new normal for the time being. We've got to kind of almost be a little bit on the balls of our feet, so to speak, with a little bit of adaptability and agility right now, and think about how we're going to adapt to this VUCA landscape where we've got volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We have got a constant stream of information that is being flooded towards us. And I think it's potentially unhealthy for us to be staying in front of the TV or looking at our Instagram or Facebook feed on a constant basis, because that flood of information can a lot of the time be unhealthy. We need to know what to do in this period of emergency, but at the same time, we've also got to be practical in how we're going to manage. Now, we know that this period of time is going to cause some increased stress, and stress has a very, very negative impact on us from a physical perspective, but also a mental health perspective, and it also has a negative impact on our immune system, the very thing that we are trying to build up now rather than tear down. So managing our stress in a more productive way is definitely an opportunity for us to feel more resilient in this very difficult period of time. I think when you think about the stress that we've always got different ways that we can interpret stress that we're experiencing. If we are working from home, we can sort of feel isolated, we can feel like we're very closed in, and sometimes if we live alone in particular, the only company we've got is that phone. But what would be a reframed way that we could look at our period of isolation in terms of what it gives us and what the opportunities is that it faces with us? We can view this challenge through the lens of fear and isolation, panic, illness. Or alternatively, we can think about what's actually happening while we're not engaging in the world. My partner's actually got family overseas, and he was saying that the view is through a very different lens. Over in Italy in particular, people are singing from their balconies to one another, and the canals in Venice are actually clear. You can see fish swimming in the canals for the first time in almost decades. That tourism and the absence of that is actually making our earth healthier. So there's also always an opportunity to think about things in a slightly different way. So changing how you think about stress and the current challenges can actually assist us to gain a healthier and more resilient perspective. And this is what we really want to do. We want to be resilient in the face of these challenges and this landscape that we've got in front of us. So one of the things that I think is really important is thinking about what your stress signature is. Every single person as an individual has a different stress signature. For example, when I'm stressed, I get a flip-floppy stomach, my mouth goes really dry, it's like the bottom of a cocky cage in there, you know, can't get any spit going. And I find that if I'm stressed over a period of time, my sleep gets really impacted. But every single person will have a different stress signature. Some people get tension headaches. Other people get real tightness in their neck and shoulders. Other people use substances, drink more coffee, a little bit more alcohol than they should. Right? Different people have different tells that really demonstrate to them that they're not coping. I think one of the biggest things is for us to get a little bit more savvy at recognising what our tells actually are. So we've got to think about, what do I look like when I'm stressed? Very often, other people are better at seeing us stressed than what we actually are. If you go home and your partner turns to you and says, "What's the matter?" and you go, "Well, nothing." And they turn to you and say, "Well, no, I can see how stressed you are." And that sometimes comes as a surprise to us because we don't know how much that tell is showing to the world. But finally, someone's held up a mirror to us and we can look in it and say, "Wow, yeah, I really am experiencing difficulty." So get more in touch with your stress signature to work out what you're displaying to self that you can work out and identify. I think it's a big question to kind of think about, is there actually an upside to stress? Right? We typically think about stress in a very, very negative way. We see it as a bad thing. But is there any positives to it? If you think about, these two questions. First option, stress is harmful, it should be avoided, reduced, managed. Or stress is helpful and should be accepted, utilised, embraced. You might even be somewhere in the middle between those two things. But I think any stressful situation coming towards us can be reframed as a challenge, an opportunity to think about how we're going to actually manage this new thing, new obstacle in perhaps a new way, just ideally for us. So stress and mindset is particularly important. The mindset we have about stress contributes to how we experience stress. Our mindset can often affect the outcome. If you've ever heard of the expression self-fulfilling prophecy, if we imagine that something's going to be bad, then often it will be. If we believe stress is harmful, I'm more likely to see it as harmful. So if we look at this, what we can recognise is that most of us have got this optimal level of stimulation in and around our stress, right? Where we have great levels of creativity, rational problem solving, we make progress, we might be willing to take a chance and we get satisfaction. But when we're overstimulated, when we've got too much stimulation for the resources that we have, we tend to make irrational problems even bigger. We don't problem solve well. We get exhausted, we might have illness, and we have low self-esteem because we don't see ourselves coping. So we've got to think about this period of overstimulation, particularly now, which is what often we've got, and think about, again, how we're going to manage that in a much more productive way. I think if you look at this, often we get a hazardous pattern when it comes to dealing with stress. We go, uh-oh, and we keep going, uh-oh, and we don't do anything to actually manage or implement a problem-solving approach. And through a lot of uh-ohs, we have breakdown or burnout. But what if we took a different approach to our stress? What if we did the uh-oh and recognised that that was having a significant impact on us, but immediately we recognised that stress signature, we then looked at active problem solving as to how we're going to manage both the internal or the external problem around us to get an outcome that's much more focused for us. How do we look at that fuel moment to get a better approach? So I want you to just take a couple of moments to think about, as an individual, what is currently causing you stress? And it's going to be different for all of us. For some of us it might be, well, I have enough supplies at home to be able to manage this current crisis. My kids are still in school. Should I be pulling them out of school? Should I keep them in school? How do I cope with the workload? How do I adapt being at home? Should I let people into the house who I know? What are the various challenges that you're having to deal with? One of the themes, though, that sits behind everybody's cause of stress is that stress arises when something we care about is at stake. Let's be honest, if you didn't care about it, you wouldn't be stressed. So there's a definite common theme running behind our stress, and that is that we get stressed about things that we care about. So we need to start thinking about the different kinds of stress that we can embrace. Yes, we can get de-stressed. All right, this is when we're not coping, or we feel overwhelmed, even pain. But there is also a kind of stress that we call eustress. And this, in some ways, allows us to think about rising to the challenge, to think about an opportunity to aid our performance, to look at problem solving to get an outcome. How do we actually focus on that eustress and see these challenges as an opportunity rather than just as a threat? Now, when we experience distress, it's consistent with burnout. A lot of us get insomnia, we can have mental health issues like depression or anxiety, and basically we feel overwhelmed. The amount of stress that we imagine that there is way above the resources that we perceive we have, and that stress overwhelms us. So how do we think about building our sources of resilience so that they are higher than the amount of stress? And that's what wins out, that level of resilience. Now, many of you will have heard of the fight-flight response. And typically that fight-flight response worked extremely well for us when we were cavemen and women being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. If you recognise the fight-flight response, if we were walking through a prehistoric forest and suddenly out between the trees over there we saw a saber-toothed tiger, a little pea-like organ in our brain called our amygdala would basically flood us with information telling us that we have got to either fight or fly from that impending danger. But that response was quite short for us. We either fought the saber-toothed tiger and ate it for dinner, or we ran back to our cave and we were safe, and the danger was over quite quickly. So we were going along calmly, the danger happened, our stress response went up, but then the danger's over and we are normalised again. But that's not how it is now. Now, when we're faced with this current crisis, we were fine, our stress response gets triggered, but now it's kept going. There's no real abate coming down the other side, it continues. And that causes our system to go into a little bit of crisis mode. We no longer got the energy we need to continue to keep us up at that anxious state on a constant basis. And so our brain takes energy from other parts, for example, our concentration, our short-term memory, our immune system, and all of a sudden we're not coping as well as we could. So there are other opportunities rather than just have that fight-flight response triggering on a constant basis. So an alternative to that distress is thinking about our eustress and how we could consider some elements of positive psychology to actually cultivate more positivity and bring that towards us. So I'm going to take you through a theory of well-being called PERMA, P-E-R-M-A, and this stands for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. Now, the father of positive psychology, who many consider the father of positive psychology, Martin Seligman, has designed this concept with his colleagues at Penn University and really given us a foundation and a framework to think about how we can build our resilience even in times of distress and think about new ways that we can perceive that distress. So I wanted to start out with this first element of positive of PERMA, which is our positive emotions. Now, one of the things that I want to indicate first is just because we talk about positive psychology doesn't mean that we're talking about happyology, right? This is one of the things that often people think positive psychology is, that we're supposed to be happy and be walking around like grinning idiots all the time. And that's not the case. Positive psychology is just about bringing more positive emotions towards us. But it's important to understand it's okay not to be okay. What's difficult for us in experiencing some more difficult emotions is not the emotion itself. For example, it's okay to experience anxiety. But what's debilitating about anxiety is not the emotion itself, it's the intensity, how much of the emotion you're experiencing, and the duration, how long you're experiencing that anxiety. That is the difficult part for us. So anxiety is an emotion like any other emotion. We wouldn't be gifted with experiencing more difficult emotions if we weren't supposed to experience them. But we can work towards decreasing the intensity and decreasing the duration of those difficult emotions so that we're coping better. So, as I mentioned, positive psychology is not about happyology. It's not a tool to eliminate negative emotions altogether. And it's not simply positive thinking. There's a lot more to it than that. So positive psychology should be just as concerned with building strength as with repairing damage, says Martin Seligman. So given this new VUCA environment, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous environment that we're dealing with, how do we manage our emotional response? Think about all those plethora of emotions that we're experiencing. How do we actually look at managing those in a more productive way? So we can do this with a couple of steps. With a little bit of self-management, we can take these 3 steps and have a look at how we're managing our emotional response through the habits that we're engaging in. So the first step is a little bit of self-control. Self-control is the ability to refrain from knee-jerk reactions in response to our emotions. I'll give you a little bit of an example. I had to run into the office only yesterday to collect a few things that I'd forgotten. And as I'm coming out of the office, up the hallway was a colleague of mine, her name's Carolyn. And as I came out of my office, I kind of, called down the hallway towards Carolyn and I said, "Morning, Carolyn." Carolyn didn't respond. In fact, she didn't even look at me. And the first automatic thought that came into my head was, what have I done? Are you there with me? Now you imagine if I let that first automatic thought out for a walk. Well, I'd had lunch with Carolyn the day before. Everything was great. We'd had a good laugh together. But I had sent her an email at around 2 o'clock that afternoon and she'd never responded. So I started to think about, was there anything in there that she could have taken offence to? But you know what, at the end of the day, if Carolyn's going to treat me like this, well, that's really her problem, but I'm just not going to speak to her again for the rest of the day. Can you see how we can go from 0 to 100 and nothing else has happened but our internal monologue? Instead of grabbing that first automatic thought and challenging it a little bit, which is what I did do, and I walked up the hallway, spoke to Carolyn and said good morning, and everything was fine. She'd had what I call her blinkers on, and she was just attending to what was immediately in front of her, and that was making an appointment for a new client, and she hadn't even heard me. So because I exercised that self-control in my thinking, I saved myself 3 days not talking to poor Carolyn. So that's our first step, that exercising that self-control. Next, it's reflecting. This is the ability to understand how it feels when that automatic thought runs away with us and we feel like we're out of control. And it's interesting that it's considered that all major emotional reactions tend to actually stem from 2 main emotions, desire and fear. Now that sounds a little bit basic, but let me show you this. Look at this list of the things that sit under our fear and our desire. Our fear of disapproval, rejection, failure, losing control, dying, losing our job, offending others, being alone, being in pain, being in a period of uncertainty. Big drivers, right? And our desire for happiness and success, acceptance, approval, security, certainty, pleasure, power, growth. These are big drivers that we're experiencing. So if we're going to recognise and have some self-reflection, we need to recognise that when we actually understand the emotion that we're experiencing, we've got an opportunity to better manage the outcome of that anxiety. So if you name it, you can tame it. So think about what it is that you've got fear about and how you're going to manage that in a more productive way. Now, a powerful but really simple technique that we can have to manage our emotions a little bit more productively is thinking about taking a reframing approach. And we talk about whether our thoughts are below the line or whether they are above the line. So if we are engaging in thoughts to ourselves that are below the line, we are typically frustrated. We might be blaming self or others. We might be focused on problems and negativity. But if we are focused above the line, we are looking at our opportunity to be responsible, to be accountable, to think of the options and the possibilities and the solutions to how we're feeling and what we're experiencing in order to gain a better outcome. And there's a simple way that we can use this approach to manage our thoughts. This is through this reframing tool. we might say a below the line statement to ourselves. For example, this is too hard. What we do is that we take the negative word in that below the line sentence, hard, we make it its opposite, easy, and then we frame it into a question to self. This is too hard. How can you make it easy? Who could you go to make this easier? Where are the resources you could access to make this easier? And suddenly, when we're above the line and we've got a solution, problem-solving approach, we tend to get better outcomes, and our stress is focused on where to go and what to do. So think about some of the self-talk that we might be engaging in. This is never going to end. Will I be all right? What's going to happen to me? How will I cope? No one cares what I'm going through. No one's going to support me. What's the point of all this anyway? Think about some of the self-language and the self-talk that you're currently engaging in. How could you reframe that to get a better outcome? We talk about identifying your ants, your automatic negative thoughts. And often I'll say to people, I can see your ants crawling all under your skin right now, and they're really getting you. So how do we take our ants, our automatic negative thoughts, really reframe them to be above the line and train them to be our pets, our performance enhancing thoughts? We can take an automatic negative thought, we can problem solve and reframe it, and we can turn it into a performance enhancing thought. What are your opportunities to think about a few avenues that you could do that with? Meet the ants. We engage in all sorts of automatic negative thinking. We can, for example, catastrophize. We can always be thinking about the worst case scenario. We could be doing black and white thinking. If I'm not a total success, then I must be a failure. We can mind read and think about what other people must be thinking about the situation. We should engage in shoulds and musts. We can overgeneralise. But a valuable way that we can really think about these ants is then to start to question them a little bit more. So, is this thought helpful to me? Is there another way of looking at this? What evidence is there that this thought's true? How would someone else see this if they were looking at my situation right now? What advice would I give someone else if this was happening to them? Is this fact or is this opinion? And if I try and come up and train my ant to be a pet, I'm coming up with more realistic or even optimistic thoughts about how I can manage this. Now, there are various ways that we can cultivate more positivity and bring that towards us. Some of you may have heard of doing a gratitude journal or a gratitude diary, and that is writing 3 things down that you've been grateful for in your day. Now, one of the things that I think people often get mistakenly into the habit of doing is that they have these really big things that they're grateful for. So, for example, they always write down, I'm thankful for having a loving partner. I'm thankful for my job being safe. I'm thankful for that my children are healthy. But sometimes it's really, really great to just put down the little things. For example, a few days ago, I didn't have a very good day at work, and I must admit I was driving home and I was not in a very good mood. And if I'd have got home in that same mood, my family would have potentially experienced the wrath of Michelle. So I realised that as I'm halfway home, I don't have something for dinner tonight. I need some meat to go with what I'm cooking. So I decided to drop into the local supermarket and see what they've got left on the shelves for me to kind of access. So I park my car and I walk into the shopping centre and my head's down, I'm a little bit annoyed. and I'm standing in front of the meat aisle at the supermarket with not a lot on display, and I'm just standing there looking up and down, feeling a little bit isolated in my own head, wondering what am I going to try and cook tonight. And suddenly, over the loudspeaker in the supermarket, came over a favourite song of mine from the 80s, 90s. I don't know if you know it, it was Dave Dobbyn's Slice of Heaven. And as I'm standing looking at where the mincemeat used to be, I found myself kind of just swinging my hips a little bit, and all of a sudden I was just singing under my breath. Now, not only did I start doing that, but an appropriate distance away from me, a lady who would have been 80 if she was a day, actually sort of walks towards me, throws her hip out at me like this and starts singing with me. You know what? It broke my mood just like that. It was fantastic. And in my gratitude diary that night went Dave Dobbyn's Slice of Heaven. It broke my mood for the whole night. And I really revelled in that experience. In fact, I'm pretty sure I will remember that tiny little episode for a long time to come. Think about savouring those moments, or sitting out in the backyard and savouring just having a beautiful Italian biscuit with a cup of coffee and thinking about the sunshine that's beating down on your face. We can engage in mindfulness. Now, a lot of people ask me what mindfulness is, and I'll often explain it to them like this. I was actually sitting with a Buddhist monk at some training recently, and he had this wonderful way of explaining it, and he did it like this. As human beings, we have 7 parts to our observable self. And these 7 parts are our 5 senses and our thoughts and feelings. The thing is that when we interact with the world, we tend to put these 2 first. Our thoughts and feelings spearhead everything that we engage in. But mindfulness is doing this, putting those thoughts and feelings down and letting your 5 senses take centre stage. What does that smell like to be in this environment? What am I seeing? What can I hear? What can I taste? What can I touch? All right? What are those actual emotions down, and actually letting your senses take centre stage and really being present and in the moment with what we're experiencing. We can undertake some random acts of kindness. We can listen to some uplifting music, and if you feel fantastic, why don't you even dance to that music? My favourite would definitely be Dancing Queen, ABBA. We can cultivate some optimism and think about what we might be able to do during this period of time and how we could act. We could perform activities that we enjoy and spend time with people that we love. What are our opportunities to actually cultivate positivity and bring that towards us with what we're experiencing, rather than just live with those negative emotions alone? We can also laugh. Science actually shows us that when we've just laughed for a minute, our productivity on average goes up 20% after we've laughed. We could also do a ta-da list. You've heard of a to-do list. A ta-da list, for example, my ta-da list has about 30 things listed down on it, and they are things that you can do that take between 10 and 30 minutes. So it might be have a bubble bath. It might be go and read a favourite book on your window shelf, looking out at the trees. It might be go and walk the dog. It might be sitting down and having a family dinner. Whatever's on your to-do list, your goal would be to ensure that you want to take 2 things on your to-do list every day, so that you're bringing that positivity towards you. Okay, what's our next part of PERMA? Is engagement. The E in PERMA stands for engagement. And engagement means that we are fully absorbed, that we're one with the music, that time stops, that we lose that sense of self-consciousness, that we're really embracing where we are and what we're doing. And we've got a state of flow. Everything's just flowing. You know how sometimes you're undertaking a task and you look down and you realise you've suddenly been sitting there for 3 hours, that time just flies, and that we've been on fire when we've been doing that task, that it just creates that state of flow for us. Typically, if we are in that state of flow, we're probably deploying and employing our strengths. Flow is achieved when you've got a combination of a challenging task and then a chance to deploy your strengths. Now, if you don't know what your strengths are, you can Google VIA character strength profile, and we consider that we have 24 character strengths. And by doing a short 10-15 minute questionnaire, you can actually get your responses and see what your 24 character strengths are ranked in order. And we look at those top 5 to 7 character strengths out of 24 being your signature strengths. Now, what is a strength? A strength is a pre-existing capacity for a particular way of behaving, thinking, or feeling that feels authentic and energizing to the user. So sometimes we'll undertake tasks that de-energize us. For example, if you asked me to do an accounting program, that would de-energize me because that's not my strength. I have complete awe for people who can manage that well. My strength is in a different area, and I feel energized, for example, when I'm learning new things. That really makes my eyes open wide and me lean into that particular task. So, what energizes and engages you? Think about what your top character strengths actually are. How do you spot your strengths? If your top strength is kindness, are you looking at how you can deploy that strength and undertake some random acts of kindness in your workplace, in your family, in your community? If your signature strength is curiosity, how are you looking at that to embrace new ways of doing things, or new ways of learning, or new ways to adapt? Use your signature strength to engage you and allow for you to have a state of flow. Okay, the R in PERMA stands for relationships. Now, one of the things that we recognise at the moment, especially with this hashtag going around, social distancing, we want to recognise that we are social creatures. Relationships and having close relationships with people actually enhances our well-being. So I'm not a big fan of this term social distancing. I'd prefer for us to think about physical distancing but social connection. This is the time where we want to be bringing those connections actually closer to us rather than further away from us. So how do we increase the ratio of those positive interactions and those positive relationships? How do we celebrate? So despite the fact that you might be working from home, how are you actually going to meetings still and seeing people through even social media means? So have you got webinars set up? Are you getting together on group chats, even for a coffee catch-up? And even, who knows, for cocktails on a Friday night with people in your social group. How can you set up and embrace and bring towards those? In this time of distress, for example, my LinkedIn profile, I've actually made connections with an additional sort of 500 people and reached out to see how they're going and brought connections to me rather than shut down those connections. So how do we get to perhaps even contact a friend that we haven't spoken to in ages just to see how they're going? Ask them a whole lot of curious questions about how they're going and what they're doing and how you could help. So let's bring and cultivate those positive relationships and bring them more towards us. Okay, the M in PERMA stands for meaning. Right? A sense of meaning is we feel that we're doing something valuable, that we have purpose, that we are connected with what we're doing. Now, people get their connection and their purpose from a range of different avenues. A lot of us get those connections from our workplace, but not always. People can get involved in a cause that matters to them. They could have a spiritual connection which gives them purpose. So we need to think about our opportunities. Where is our purpose and how can we reconnect with that right now? So how do we apply those signature strengths that we've got with a sense of purpose? What is our opportunity to funnel those into an actual outcome to give us more value? I think we can also, if we're lacking purpose, have an opportunity just to sit down with a pen and paper or your laptop and think about writing about your future self. What does it actually look like? What could you do to actually visualize the outcome? Where do you want to be? How do you want to be? How do you want to behave and act? Then you can think back, now what are the steps that I would need to do to get to making that visualization a reality? We can use our value set, what is of value to us, to actually think about how we're going to achieve that outcome and derive meaning and connection with what we're doing on a daily basis. Reconnect with that purpose on what you do every day. The last part of PERMA is the A, and this is our accomplishment, a very important part of our wellbeing piece right now. So having a sense of accomplishment means that we're working towards or achieving a goal that is important to us. But a lot of us don't actually have those goals. We think about perhaps I often sort of liken a lot of people's goals to being New Year's resolution goal setters. And do you know how long the average New Year's resolution lasts? It's 3 hours to 3 weeks. So there's not a lot of stickability to those goals. And if we want to have stickability towards a goal and an outcome, we've really got to think about how we're going to achieve that. One of the first things that we can actually reflect on is the 3 W's. What's working well for us right now? All right, if we look at what we're doing, what's in our current arsenal of resilience and well-being that's actually working well for us? How could we bring that more to the front of what we're working with and recognizing the capacity we've got to build on that current reflection? We then can also step into a growth mindset. If you haven't heard this term before, it's based on a concept by a professor over at Stanford University named Professor Carol Dweck. And Dweck's written this fantastic book called Mindset, and she discusses the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. I think when we talk about a growth mindset, we recognise that with hard work, we can achieve anything. I'll give you a bit of an example of this. I've got 4 kids, but my second daughter, Laura, she completed Year 12 last year. And as she would sit down at the homework table each night, one of the common things that she would say to me is, "Mum, I can't do it." And I would turn to her and say, "Laura, you haven't finished the sentence." And she would roll her eyes at me. This is a very important part of the interaction. And then she would say, "Okay, Mum, I can't do it yet." And I think that's a really important part of a growth mindset mentality. We recognise that we may not have the skill and the ability to do it at the moment, but with hard work and dedicated action and some problem solving, we know that the yet will come, and we have the ability to recognise we can't do it yet. How do we embrace that a little more often? Self-coaching model named GROW, G-R-O-W, is also a fantastic way to get traction on achieving our goals. G is what's the goal? R, what's my current reality? O, what are my options? W, now what's the way forward? What's the goal? What's my reality? What are my options? Now what's the way forward? When we think about goal achievement in that way, it actually gives us a template to think about how we're going to achieve. Now, we've also got to celebrate that success. How are we moving forward to gain our outcomes? And then celebrate, we got there. We've actually achieved this and it's not as bad as we thought. We can do it with a little bit of support, assistance, and some self-belief. So how do we cultivate that last A in PERMA, accomplishment? I think we've got to think about 3 basic steps. Acknowledge the stress in your body. Welcome it by realizing that it's just data to tell you a little bit about your current stress signature and that this stress is something that you care about, and that's never a bad thing. We can use the energy that that stress creates and look at it in a positive way to actually problem solve and cultivate that positivity and bring that closer towards us. Now I want to finish off telling you a little bit of a story. My husband, he's a mammal. If you don't know what a mammal is a middle-aged man in lycra. I love my husband, so I don't tell him what he looks like in his lycra, but that's another thing. Now, every July, I've got big circles under my eyes because he makes me stay up in the middle of the night and watch the Tour de France with him. Now, I have to admit that it's got a little bit boring because every year this team, Sky, are winning the Tour de France. In fact, they've won it 7 times out of the last 8 years. So on day 1, you almost know that at day 21, Sky is going to win. So I think, what's the point in watching it? However, it wasn't always like this. 10 years ago, this team Sky, whose basis is the British cycling team, they couldn't even win an egg and spoon race, let alone the Tour de France. And along came this new coach, and his name is David Brailsford. And Brailsford had this understanding that he couldn't turn a losing team into a winning team overnight, that he had to think of the process in that goal achievement to create a winning team as to what he was going to implement. So the process he came up with was to consider the aggregation of marginal gains. So what his thinking was, we're just going to change every single thing we do and improve it by 1%. We're going to have a look at the pillows that we sleep on with the goal of getting 1% better sleep hygiene. We're going to look at the food that we consume with the goal of getting 1% greater energy. We're going to look at the pedals on the bike to get 1% greater energy from every time we push that pedal. Everything we're going to do, we're just going to look at improving by 1%. Now you imagine if you applied that to your resilience and your personal well-being and your positivity. Even think about your relationships. What if over the course of the next month you were to improve your relationships with your partner by 1%, with your children 1%, by your friends and family 1%, with your boss 1%, with your work colleagues 1%, even with your parents-in-law 1%? What would be the aggregation of all of those marginal gains at the end of that 4-week period to you and your personal well-being? So I'll leave you with that thought in thinking about challenging how you're going to not only survive this very challenging period of time, but also how you're going to thrive in this challenging space and cultivate a greater level of positivity to bring that towards you. Thanks so much for listening.